When nations find themselves in crisis, and the people of these countries living with an element of fear, it becomes all too easy for freedoms to be lost. As we worry about the day-to-day necessities, or the fear of war, or as we're seeing now, the threat of an apparently deadly pandemic, our focus has shifted away from maintaining our liberties and toward a more urgent sense of self-preservation. We are so concerned about making it through to the next day or the next week that we fail to consider whether that new dawn will be more treacherous or harsher than the current crisis. Is this perhaps how all freedoms are lost? Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Wise words, but not, as many believe, spoken by Thomas Jefferson. There's an earlier claim to this adage from one Wendell Phillips, the American abolitionist and activist. Speaking at an anti-slavery meet, he said, quote, "Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Power is ever stealing from the many to the few. The manna of popular liberty must be gathered each day, or it is rotten. The living sap of today outgrows the dead rind of yesterday." End quote. But here's the rub. A loss of freedom most commonly happens when the people give up their rights without protest or sound. As the coronavirus sweeps the globe, the citizens and subjects of each nation are allowing governments to create new laws to restrict freedoms and to cast us along a very dark path. What's worse is that many of the fellow citizens seem intent on supporting this despotic turn of events. On today's edition of The Rabbit Hole, I want to discuss not only what is happening today, but also look at what happened in East Germany, how neighbour turned on neighbour, friend on friend, and even families. How in the name of being a good citizen, the population sided with a tyrannical government and became informers to the state. And ultimately, how the very same thing is happening right now, today. East Germany, known as the German Democratic Republic, GDR, was a communist state that came into being in 1949. Even the name of it is clearly misleading, as this was no democracy as we would call it today. George Orwell wrote an essay on politics in the English language, in which he described how the word democracy can so often be twisted. He wrote, quote, "In the case of a word like democracy, not only is there no agreed definition, but the attempt to make one is resisted from all sides. It is almost universally felt that when we call a country democratic, we are praising it. Consequently, the defenders of every kind of regime claim that it is a democracy, and fear that they might have to stop using the word if it were tied down to any one meaning. Words of this kind are often used in a consciously dishonest way." End quote. Instead, the people were encouraged to become zealots for this supposed communist democracy, and woe betide any who professed otherwise. The whole economy was centrally planned, and more of the satellite nation became state-owned as time went on. This meant that food and basic goods were not distributed through the usual practice of supply and demand, but rather by decree, with the state setting the prices. Right now in the modern West, we see supply issues due to COVID-19, and we need to be wary that we don't start demanding our governments step up and do more to take over how supplies are administered. To misquote an old 14th century proverb made most famous by Benjamin Franklin, "For want of a toilet paper, a kingdom was lost." The GDR, fully backed by the Soviets, was not able to wield such complete control through force of arms. It was 1,000 tiny cuts that encouraged the people to accept what was happening to them. There are food shortages, so they demand the government takes more control of the food supply. There was petty crime, encouraged by the state, and the people demanded the Stasi have more powers. We may look back across the void of time and wonder at how these people could have been so foolish. But that would be ignorant. For many today are demanding the very same. It is so rarely the state that is ultimately responsible for a lack of liberty. It is the people refusing to be independent, refusing to accept that it is their own responsibility to make things work. When we hear about the amount of informers who would tattle to the Stasi about their neighbours being thought criminals, it's a misconception that this was about greed. Estimates vary on how many people out of the 16 million population actively informed. At any one time, there was between 170,000 and roughly 190,000 inoffizielle Mitarbeiter, IMs, unofficial collaborators on the books. But such meticulous records were not kept for those who spoke to their local officials off the books, those who would make anonymous reports. Some sources suggest that 1 in 6 people at some point or another were informing to the government. How does this happen? Well, as mentioned, it often wasn't a case of greed. It was ideology. Coming back to today, in the UK, we are seeing people fined for not following the coronavirus guidelines. And of course, those who refuse to pay the fines or can't pay the fines, as many people are being forced to stop work, they'll go to prison. But what are these hideous crimes they're committing? Well, in many cases, they're leaving their homes more than once per day, or they are visiting elderly relatives, or they're found sitting on a park bench when they should apparently either be exercising or at home. Such wicked, wicked crimes indeed. But the nadir, the true horror taking place, is that these hardened criminals are being informed on by their own neighbours. Online portals set up by the police are being used to anonymously inform on neighbours. Drones operated by the police are filming people innocently walking their dogs in the remote countryside. The footage then splashed across social media to shame the wrongdoers. If this living terror sounds familiar, you've likely read George Orwell's dystopian classic 1984, where neighbours tell on neighbours, where telescreens watch your every move. The modern world is becoming more like Airstrip 1 with every passing day. Again, in the UK, the children are home from school. Part of a nationwide program is for the kids to draw a rainbow picture and display it in their front windows for the duration. Putting aside the politicization of the rainbow symbol for a moment, what possible educational value is the displaying of a picture to the outside world in your home? Are we coming to a point where children who do not follow the instructions will be penalized, ostracized, or even the parents for not encouraging the social conformity of their offspring? In the novel 1984, there's a terrifying chapter where Winston Smith attends the 2-minute hate, this celebration of anger directed at the enemy, Goldstein. Such a thing couldn't possibly happen in modern Britain, could it? Well, let me offer a few examples. There's the drone footage of innocent dog walkers. It's shared on social media to encourage the public to pour their scorn on these rebellious rule breakers, and sadly, it worked. There have been a few noble commenters who question the police invasive techniques, but the majority, sadly, yes, the majority of comments were aimed at those county ramblers. The vitriol was quite something. And how about an actual 2-minute hate? Well, not quite, but how about a state-approved 2-minute appreciation? You may not think there's anything wrong with showing appreciation, but the motivation behind the act is the same: to create conformity and to ostracize those who refuse to take part. Just a short time before this podcast was recorded, people the length and breadth of Britain were encouraged to stand on their front steps at precisely 8 p.m. and applaud the National Health Service workers. People took videos of their streets, paying particular attention to the houses that did not engage. Now, the NHS workers, the national health workers, they sure do deserve some appreciation, especially in times like this. But for the state to encourage this kind of organised action, and to essentially force people to engage through fear of being named and shamed, is every bit as tyrannical as Orwell's 2 minutes of hate. We're beginning to turn on each other, and once we walk through that traitor's gate, there's no chance of turning back. We maintain our freedoms only because we are strong individually. When we fall to pressure and fear, we give up our liberty, and we may never get it back. By being strong as individuals, we can be strong as a society. You can't have one without the other. And it goes the other way too. Without a strong society, of freedoms, of rights, we can't make strong individuals. I'll leave you with the words of Rudyard Kipling and the first part of his poem, The Law of the Wolves. Now this is the law of the jungle, as old and as true as the sky. And the wolf that shall keep it may prosper, but the wolf that shall break it must die. As the creeper that girdles the tree trunk, the law runneth forward and back. For the strength of the pack is the wolf, and the strength of the wolf is the pack.